Okay, well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just a few housekeeping issues before we start. We are recording this session, so please be aware of that, and we will post the session after the completion on the iTHRIV portal for viewing for anyone who has missed it. I will also encourage you while the talk is going on to go ahead and use the chat. We will save some time at the end for some conversation with our wonderful speaker, Dr. Howell. So with that, I will open the session. So let me formally say good afternoon and welcome. My name is Karen Johnston. I am the director of iTHRIV, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our Voices in Clinical and Translational Science series, sponsored by the Integrated Translational Health Research Institute of Virginia, or iTHRIV. As you may recall, the mission of iTHRIV is to catalyze and sustain inclusive clinical and translational research through diverse collaborative team science, innovative data science, and broad workforce development in order to improve human health and promote health equity. This series serves as a platform to lift outstanding researchers and underrepresented voices in research across the iTHRIV partnership, with a focus on promoting dialogue and encouraging team science. The series is aimed at amplifying diverse perspectives in clinical and translational research to foster innovation and an inclusive environment. We have been highlighting some of our amazing iTHRIV researchers who share their research and their lived experience with us. So today, it is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Brittany Howell. Dr. Howell is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at Virginia Tech and in the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute at Virginia Tech Carilion. I will also highlight that Dr. Howell is a recent iTHRIV Scholar alum. She just completed her iTHRIV Scholar program this spring. So congratulations to Dr. Howell on that. She received her bachelor's degree in neuroscience and cell and molecular biology at Tulane and her Ph.D. in neuroscience at Emory University. Prior to coming to Virginia Tech, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship at University of Minnesota. Her scientific focus blends biological and behavioral analyses to capture a wide range of factors implicated in healthy human brain development. She is particularly interested in maternal factors that impact infant neurodevelopment. And I have to say, she exemplifies team science and with her highly collaborative and community engaged research program. More recently, she has received an NIH R21 Trailblazer Early Career Award. We congratulate her on that, and that supports her work. So today, she will share with us some of her research and some of her lived experience in her talk entitled Milkmaid: How Strong Women in a Rural Childhood Shaped My Research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Howell. Thank you, Brittany, for being here.
No, well, thank you for the lovely introduction, Karen. And I have to say that I feel like I'm a little heavy on the lived experience in this presentation because I've done a lot of science presentations. So if I leave out interesting science, of course, ask questions at the end, but also feel free to hop on the FBRI YouTube channel and you can watch some of the more sciencey things. But I wanted to take this opportunity to really explore, what it is about my own journey that shaped kind of how I look at science. And I'm really, really excited to have the opportunity to share lived experience because I don't think we often enough take the time to recognize and celebrate each other's lived experiences and recognize how it has impact how we do our science and how we view our theories. And it's all interconnected, at least for me. Maybe I'm just, I stand out in that way, but I don't think so. There's a slight caveat here that I'm going to come off as extremely self-aware throughout this. Know that is completely hindsight. So I was not, as an undergrad, knowing what I was going to do, but I think I've been very fortunate to recognize opportunity, and I've been supported by many, many strong women, which I'm going to celebrate as we go through. And in that vein, I like to start all of my presentations with gratitude. And so I'm going to start with professional gratitude here, because hopefully throughout the presentation, it will become really clear how much gratitude I have for my family. So I didn't add them here, but this is the A version of the Howell Mind, or Maternal Influence on Neurodevelopment Lab. And I have to always start with thanking them, because there's no way that I could do anything without them. And I do mean everything. And of course, our participating families I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for them. So thank you, including the mom who stayed with us last night for about 4 hours so we could get a single image of her 12-month-old. She did an amazing job. All right, so diving into a little more specifics. So where am I from? I am from a little town in southeast New Hampshire called Northwood. And actually, so this is Northwood Center. I'm way down here. I was really close to Nottingham. But the reason I highlight that is because it's considered a rural part of the United States, like officially, and it genuinely is, right? I mean, there's a lot of green in this picture here. And that I didn't recognize as being important to me until I moved away. And I spent many, many years away. And we'll get back to how I kind of got back to the rural part of the country, semi-rural where we are now. But it really isn't, and it doesn't mean a whole lot if I just tell you I'm from, a small town in Northwood, or in New Hampshire rather. But what really I think will help people better understand where I'm coming from is hearing more about the people who I was raised by. And so I'm going to start a few generations back. I don't have a great picture of my great-grandmother Nellie. This is a picture of a newspaper clipping my mother took. She doesn't have, or we couldn't find a good picture because, of course, this was back in the day where pictures were actually fairly hard to come by. And that's a photo of a newspaper clipping of a portrait that was drawn. But I think the reason I bring that up is she raised her family during the Depression. And the woman that I know much more, my great grandmother passed away before I was born, is her daughter Ruth, right here, who's my Grammy. This is how I remember her, and I will always remember her this way, as wearing the obnoxious, I'm pretty sure those are the free sunglasses she got from the eye doctor when they dilate your eyes, because she wasn't going to waste them, right? They're just as good as the ones I can buy. She was the woman that, bought moldy cheese because it was inexpensive, and you just cut the mold off, it's fine. She was just a pillar of frugality and just she was somebody. Oh, I think somebody
That's good. From Maryland
needs to mute. Thank you. And somebody who I really loved and admired, and I'm really glad I got to get to know her. But primarily, she influenced my own mother, who I need to send an apology to my mom because I didn't ask her if I could use this photo before I put it on here, but I love this photo. So this is my mom on the far left in front of an X-ray machine. So she was an X-ray tech for her whole career. I say recently, it's been about 3 years now, she retired. She worked third shift for years and years because she liked to. She also usually had 2 or 3 jobs ever since I can remember. Actually, that's not true. When I was in high school, I think she was down to just the 1. But prior to that, she always had 2 to 3 jobs. My parents were divorced when I was about 2, roughly. And that was primarily due to my father's struggle with alcoholism. And I don't mean to, I'm not going to mention my dad more, but know that he's a great guy. I don't want to paint that picture. But just to know that, because this will come back when we talk about my research more specifically, addiction has touched my family in many, many ways. My stepdad, who I knew, he moved in when I was 8, he struggled with alcoholism. And then I've had lots and lots of other, kind of substance dependencies influence or impact my family. And that has 100% kind of flavored the kind of work that I do. But the important piece, one of the more important pieces about that is I didn't recognize any of these issues at all until I was an adult. And I sat down with my mom and my sister, who was pictured at a much younger age here. Her name is Katie. She's 8 years older than I am. And when my mom was at work, Katie was the one who took care of me. And so I always, when I talk about how important Moms are, she always comes up, not only because she was kind of like my mom when I was little, but also because she had her first daughter when she was 17 and I was 9. And this is a picture of Mackenzie, who's now turning 25, which is crazy. But what often I think is viewed as being a sign of adversity, right? And not saying that it isn't, but something like having a family member who was a teenage mother. She exemplified strength. She finished high school. She went on to get a college degree. And so I have to attribute a lot of my own kind of grit to these two women. And I'm going to try not to get teary as I continue, because it's hard sometimes being so far from them. But anyway, back on track. So just know that, I come from I think an underrepresented group, although unfortunately, I think addiction has touched most of our lives. And certainly teenage pregnancy and single motherhood and all of those kinds of things. To add to that, not only, was I kind of socially, in an adverse situation, so to speak, but I grew up on a farm, right? So I grew up in a rural part of the country. And this is my mom mucking out the barn. And the reason I chose this picture is this is very much her. You'll notice she has, although this picture, again, these are scanned physical photos because digital pictures weren't a thing then. So they're a little blurry. But you'll notice her nails are perfect. She always had perfect nails. And I actually think at this point, this is probably right around the time when having like gemstone studs in your nails where it was cool. And she always had one, just the one. But anyway, so, I grew up on a farm being surrounded by animals and birth. These are pictures that we took, right? Because we were celebrating the birth of a baby goat here. This is a piglet. Although you can't see her name is Petunia. And this was my lamb, Buck, who wasn't a lamb here, but he slept in my bed. I bottle fed him. I had an interesting and wonderful, wonderful childhood growing up in such a small town. And just as evidence of how small that is, this is a current picture of my elementary school. It looks exactly the same. And it's been a hot minute since I was in elementary school. And then I had to share this very excited picture of myself presenting on Krista McAuliffe in 2nd grade. But, the point being, I don't think I had a very exceptional, from my perspective, it wasn't a super exceptional childhood. We always had what we needed. Most of the time we had what we wanted, or at least what we thought we wanted. But it was just pretty standard. I don't know. I think it felt pretty average. And so as I was putting together this presentation, I was like, I wonder if there's any data out there. Of course, I'm a scientist. I like data. Data on kind of where do people from where I grew up go? What happens to them? And of course, I know my friends. I'm still in touch with a lot of my friends from elementary school. We still get together. But I wanted to see again, what data exist. And so I found this really super cool website, and I encourage everybody to take a peek at it, called opportunityatlas.org. And what this shows is and you can put in your town, you can look at the state level and the county level, and it gives you a bunch of demographics of children at 35 years of age that grew up in these areas. And so, actually where I grew up isn't too bad, right? 40% college graduation rate. I couldn't get graduate level. It wasn't that granular, but not too bad. And the average salary is about $45K a year, which is about what my mom raised me and my sister on back, although that was, not recent. So, not great, not terrible. And so, it just, where statistically should I be? And I'm going to plant that seed because that's going to come up a little bit later. As I was putting this together, I also was reminded of, for any of us who have put in NIH grants, right? There are designations that you can have. And one of those is a disadvantaged background. And so I'm so close, and this is not something I guess that you should celebrate necessarily, but I'm very close to being from a disadvantaged background. So I'm not going to read these to you. I've highlighted the 2 that would apply very clearly. And I actually haven't asked my mom. I think I actually was eligible for Pell Grants as well. I don't know that we ever did any WIC or anything like that because my mom worked 2 or 3 jobs. It was very important to her that she not accept help if she really didn't need it. And she could work 2 to 3 jobs, so she didn't feel like she needed that support. But I'm not from a disadvantaged background because my mother has a bachelor's degree. And I always give her a hard time about this. And I've told this story a million times to people because she decided to get a bachelor's in social work with my sister when my sister decided to go to college just for fun. So she does have a bachelor's, but never used it. She just genuinely really valued education and wanted to better herself that way. And so I do give her a hard time. It's like, I could be way more competitive for grants, Mom, if you just hadn't gone and gotten your bachelor's. But she loved it. And I honestly think that passion for education is why I'm here today, because, you know, she did things like when I said, I want to get out of New Hampshire. Where do I want to go to college? I want to go to Tulane, one of the most expensive private universities in the country. And, you know, her response was, you know, if that's what you want to do, we'll make it work. And, you know, again, this sounds like I was a very grateful teenager. I was not. I don't know that many of us are. But looking back on it, I'm unbelievably grateful because it allowed me to get on the path that I am today. And not many people, I think, would have said, yeah, you know, of course, we'll figure out how to pay $40,000 a year. You know, I got scholarships and she took out loans. I'm still paying off student loans for my undergraduate education. But we made it work. But while I was at Tulane, so that's kind of my childhood background. So again, farming, you know, we were working with not much, but we made it work. And I think we did pretty well. But then I went to the big city of New Orleans. Huge culture shock, but in the best way possible. It was amazing. Partly because, or maybe not even partly, I can say mostly, because I met my husband. Of course, we weren't married at the time, but this is Daniel, and I have to apologize in advance as well because I didn't ask permission to put photos of him in here. There are only a couple because he doesn't really like to have pictures of himself in here, but I'll often refer to myself as we, and mostly because Daniel and I have been together for about 20 years now. It's been a long time. And it's been really important that I've had that support. But anyway, so I was in New Orleans and I was an undergrad. And, you know, if you're a smart kid from the country, what do? So you always go to college, right? That was always a given. Again, my mom was very adamant that I was going to some kind of secondary education. If I had decided to be a plumber or an electrician or go, you know, she wouldn't have cared as long as I got some more education beyond high school. But I always did well in school. I loved science, kind of loved math a little bit. And so it was very clear that I was going to go to college. Once we decided Tulane, you know, we figured out how to pay for it, kind of. And then I got there and I was like, I'm going to do biomedical engineering. Found out how much math was involved, quickly shifted to neuroscience, which was a great, you know, that was my double major anyway. So it wasn't a huge shift. But anyway, my point is I got there and I was like, what am I doing? Because I didn't want to be a medical doctor. I didn't want to be a lawyer. And that was kind of where I thought, you know, well, smart people, that's what smart people do, right? You get some sort of prefix in front of your name. Or suffix, depending on what you do. But then I was like, I'm going to be a veterinarian. So I got the idea that I was going to do a DVM Ph.D. And so I was talking with a professor about doing a summer research experience at NIH, because NIH seemed like a great place to do research, right? Again, totally no idea how big a deal it was to get a summer position at NIH, or, you know, just totally naive to any of that. And so I went to get a recommendation from one of my professors in an anthropology class that I'd done well in. And he said, would you like to work with monkeys? It's a weird question, but hey, why not, right? Because I wanted to be a veterinarian. So that made total sense to me. So he talked to his daughter who was working at NIH at the animal facility out in Poolesville, Maryland. And I got a summer position. And that was, you know, one of the biggest pieces of serendipity I think that has ever happened to me in my whole life, because just in saying yes to that position and getting to work in the lovely trailers out in Poolesville, this is me. I don't know why I look so angry, because I genuinely loved it. I was there for 2 summers. I did my first scientific presentation. I hung this poster up in my dorm room when I got back. But this is where my passion for my specific research questions really started. And again, it was all because I chose this one random professor to get a recommendation from. So first lesson, don't ever take an opportunity, even if it's something that you aren't really sure about or is kind of scary, don't take it for granted and just go for it, right? It was just a summer. But what I was doing out in Poolesville, I was actually working as part within a lab in the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. So again, this was something near and dear to my heart. This is something that impacted my family and continued to impact my family throughout my whole life. And so I was like, I can use my science-iness to improve things for people while working with animals. This is amazing. This is perfect. So what I was doing all that summer was out in the middle of kind of nowhere, Maryland, getting adolescent monkeys drunk. That was literally my job. I mixed Kool-Aid with vodka and put it in feeders and then watched them to make sure nobody got hurt. So I was kind of the bouncer. I was making sure that the adolescent monkeys were doing okay. But the thing that really sparked my interest is exemplified in this figure here. So the model that we were looking at were differences in early experience. So in these models, the mother-reared animals are raised by their moms, just like any other monkey, but these are in small social groups. The peer-reared animals, however, were removed from their moms on the day of birth and were raised in groups of 4 in the nursery. And so we knew from other behavioral things from other studies that behaviorally, these animals are a little strange. And so my very first day going and working in Poolesville was shown all of the animal facilities. And you walk in and you see these groups of animals. And there are some that are they're all huddled together as shown in this figure. They're sucking their thumbs or their toes. They're rocking. And that's really... it stood out. At the time, I didn't know it was really atypical, but it did seem a little weird. And then I started, as I continued to work, I started to ask questions about it. And those are the peer-reared animals. And what was interesting to me was that those were adolescents and adults. And so this experience of being mother or peer-reared was really only different for the first 6 months of these animals' lives. Besides that, they were all the same. And so you see this difference in alcohol consumption when they're in single cages. So our peer-reared animals are drinking a ton more alcohol. I mean, and they're getting inebriated for sure, absolutely, when they're in their cages by themselves. But then you put them in a social context and you see slight but not statistically different or statistically significant increase, which is super interesting. But I wanted to understand what is it that's driving these long-term differences. And so I was a junior at Tulane when I started to think about this. And it really came back to social exposure and social experience. And so I kept, thinking back, early adversity and thinking back to my own childhood and why am I not an alcoholic, right? Why am I not, a single mom? Why, what is it that has supported me and gotten me to stay on the path that I'm on? And so I started to really think about early experience in a, both in a research as me search kind of way, as well as a science way. And so it turns out that there is a very long-standing theory about developmental programming. And of course, as an undergrad, this was mind-blowing to me and a little scary, but there's lots of evidence that early exposure to adverse or benevolent experiences impacts the brain and behavior. And this is particularly true early in life because there are lots of neural systems that are developing very, very quickly. And it's those systems that are developing quickly that are particularly sensitive or vulnerable, depending on how you want to kind of shape that. And so as an undergrad, I was so excited about this question and a little scared, right? Because I had a lot of the adversities that I had been reading about, right? I grew up in a low SES environment in a rural part of the country, with family members that struggled with addiction and a single mom and, whoa, what's going to be wrong with me, right? But scientifically, I wanted to understand more and I started to ask more questions. And I was unbelievably fortunate to start my graduate work with an amazing woman. So here's another sheet of, or just an array of strong women. Mar Sanchez, who's shown in the middle here. She's a brilliant Spaniard. She grew up in Madrid, and a piece of trivia for anybody, I don't know if any of you know Mar or will ever get to interact with her, but she was supposed to be a nun. Her parents really, really, really wanted her to become a nun. And she said, no, that's not for me. I have too many questions to ask. And so she started to learn and dig into stress physiology. And so I joined her group at Emory to dig more into the impacts of early adversity and specifically early social experience. And so I'm not going to name the other names, but just know that I have been the beneficiary of so much support from so many strong women and men as well. But again, primarily women for whatever reason. I'm not sure why that is, but it's been helpful as I move through life. But anyway, these are all a kind of subset of the amazing women that I've been supported by, but really primarily Mar. She is my academic mother. My children call her Tia because we're not allowed to call her Abuela because it makes her feel old. So we don't call her Abuela. But anyway, so Tia Mar joined her lab back in, oh my goodness, 2007, something like that. And I was studying early adversity. And we know that early adversity in humans comes in all these different flavors. And again, I identified with a lot of these. And so it was a little eye-opening, a little scary, especially when you start to look at some of the outcomes of early life stress. We're at higher risk for all sorts of psychiatric disorders. There are deficits in physical growth, and those papers are specifically looking at slowed growth. But now we have lots of evidence for long-term impacts on metabolism and increased risk for obesity across the lifespan. There are alterations in stress responses themselves. And of course, what I was interested in, just because I love the brain, were the alterations in brain structure and function. And so that's what I focused all of my graduate work on. And I'm not going to talk a ton about my graduate work. I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavor. But it turns out, and again, this is serendipity, totally. I didn't target monkeys as my first research experience. I don't know how I could have put that together, even if I had really wanted to. But fortunately, it turns out that monkeys are great models for neurodevelopmental questions. And why? It's because they have very similar brains, particularly in the connectivity, both structural and functional, of the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here. So this is a human brain, and this is a monkey brain. This is a rat brain. On the far right, they are relatively fast developing. So if you multiply the monkey age by 4, that's roughly the equivalent human age. So that's helpful when you want to graduate at some point. And then they have this really beautiful social complexity. And one of the things that I think is really hilarious, again, hindsight is 2020, is that the Rhesus monkeys that we were studying live in matrilines. And so that means that if you're a female, you stay in your natal group and you live with your mothers and your aunts and your sisters, and the males are the ones that leave. And so it was this really constant kind of thread of maternal importance and women supporting women, even in ways that I didn't recognize until I had left. But anyway, monkeys are great models. So for my graduate work, I was looking at rhesus monkey development. This is why my PhD took 7 years, because we were watching monkeys grow. And I'm not going to walk through the developmental milestones. That's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make here is that I knew a lot about monkeys, a ton about monkeys. I knew when they weaned. I knew what social play meant. I knew how long the gestation was, all of those things. And when we were looking at the impacts of early adversity, I could look really, really specifically at things such as where is maltreatment or abuse and neglect impacting white matter in the brain. And so part of my dissertation work was showing these very, very specific impacts on this very specific, these very specific white matter bundles. The point being that we could look really super specifically, and I knew a lot about monkeys, but I didn't know a lot about humans, and I wanted to help people. Now, in parallel to this, to the scientific kind of journey, life goes on, right? And you're having life journeys as well. So in the midst of all of this, I got married. And then about 6 months before I defended my dissertation, I had my first daughter. And nothing puts life into perspective like having a child. And it just, dissertations, although overwhelming, have to come second, right? There's nothing like taking care of another human being that puts things into perspective. And so this is my only belly picture, because I was not a fan of belly pictures. And then this is me after I was accessing the monkeys, because of course we have to go in to get them to get blood and all of that kind of stuff. So it was during a thunderstorm. It was awful. I remember that day, but we had to get it done that day. So of course we took pictures of us being gross. But this is one of my absolute favorite pictures on the planet, because this is when I walked. And this, of course, when I told my mom I was done, or getting close to being done with my dissertation, she of course asked me, when are you graduating? And I told her I was defending in December. And she's like, well, what is that? And this reminded me again that, my family is not an academic family. They had no idea what I was talking about. And I was like, well, that's when, I present my work and it's, in public and people can ask questions. And then my committee asks me questions to make sure that, I'm ready to be conferred a PhD. And she was like, okay, do I need to be there? And my response was, you don't have to, but I would love for you to be there. And so she came, and I talked to her after, and she was like, I have no idea what you were talking about, but I am so proud because obviously the people who did know what you were talking about there, were having good conversations with you. And I think it was interesting for her to see me in that context, because I was always kind of the gray sheep of the family, so to speak. And seeing me in kind of my natural habitat, so to speak, was really, I think, eye-opening for her as well. But anyway, she came to my defense. I went out to eat. It was great. And then she came for what she thought was the more exciting part, which was the walking and the wearing of the silly hats and all of that cool stuff. But Nellie, my older daughter, was about 6 months when I defended. She's much older here because I walked in May after I defended. But the point is that when I had my daughter, it really sharpened my questions. And so what I ended up thinking about more was, how do I integrate some of the conclusions, overarching conclusions from my PhD work into my next step, right? And so we know that there's evidence for developmental programming, particularly in white matter. We know that the effects of caregiving, whether it's good or bad, are very long lasting. And for me, it was really important to integrate animal studies, right? Do translational work, but do it in a way where we can actually we can translate it. I'm trying to use a different word, but that's the best word, into things that are helpful for actual people, right? My sister was a social worker. And so these were the people with early adversity. Those were a lot of her clients, right? That's who she was working with. She had boots on the ground, and I talked to her constantly about it. And it was becoming really, really dissatisfying to know that the science that I was doing was so far from helping. And not that it wouldn't help, but call it a character flaw. I needed something that was a little more immediate. So I wanted to dig into what are the biological pathways that may be contributing to some of these observations. And so again, life is happening at the same time that thinking about science is happening. And I was struggling so hard to breastfeed Nellie, Nellie was my first daughter, named after my great-grandmother. And so it occurred to me and I started to, do some PubMed searches about milk and breastfeeding, the importance of breastfeeding. Of course, I did that all through my pregnancy. But it was eye-opening, and it was one way that I think my lived experience has, in an amazing way, shaped how I think about science. I mean, honestly, it's one of the main foci of the lab currently, and it was kind of sparked by my own struggles. Because at the end of the day, I really just want to help people who are struggling and give them tools. So all of this, struggling with breastfeeding, milk seems to be really important for brain development. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And it was time for me to move on. I couldn't stay, in my although Mar would have been very happy if I had wanted to stay. But it was time for me and Daniel and Nellie, and we had 2 dogs and 2 cats at the time. It was time for us to move. And so I ended up doing a postdoc, as Karen said, at the University of Minnesota at the Institute of Child Development, working with Jed Elison, who is pictured here. And this is one of my friends, Suyun Sung. But anyway, I kind of jumped into that postdoc because I wanted to understand better what was happening in kids. Selfishly, I had one, and I don't know about the other parents in the room, but I just still am not really sure that what I'm doing is what I should be doing, right? If you all are confident that what you're doing is what you should be doing, please come talk to me, because I need all that, I'll take all the help I can get and share that wisdom with others. But anyway, while I was there, I started to dig into this idea of lactational programming. So it's a different flavor, so to speak, of that developmental programming that I talked about earlier. And so this is the idea that milk and constituents of milk shape the brain and behavior. And so there's a series of papers, both in monkeys, as well as humans, that start to say that breastfeeding can impact things like temperament, personality, cognitive development. And then we start to get down to the things that I thought were super cool, which were things like brain. So again, a little scary because I was struggling. And so I wasn't able to provide milk to my daughter. I was giving her formula. So this is another thing where, maybe my selfishness and wanting to answer questions that are important to me came up. But I also think that translates to passion and excitement for the work that you do, which is very important. So when I was in Minnesota, I was thinking about this lactational programming, and then this amazing project started where I was helping with collecting infant MRI. So for my dissertation, I had collected MRI in monkeys. Very different. They're sedated. We have we don't have as much time in the scanner, but it's a lot more flexible. I developed a bunch of stuff so that we could get beautiful pictures of baby brains, such as that shown here. And these, although in chronological time, this daughter has not been born yet, but this is my second daughter, Eliza, who was a participant in Baby Connectome, and this is her brain at 10 weeks old. But Connectome was this amazing effort jointly attempted by University of Minnesota and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to collect imaging and behavioral data on 500 kids. And this is just to show you the age range. So we have 2 weeks all the way up through, I think the original design was 44 months for the longitudinal piece. And then we went up to 5 years in the cross-sectional piece. So the point being, this is a massive effort, and I was unbelievably lucky to be a part of it. However, there wasn't much here about milk. And so I asked if I could start to collect milk to dig into that question. And Jed, being an amazing mentor, was like, sure, but get money for it. So I got a supplement for it. And after I got my supplement, we got some more money from Nestle to add fecal microbiome samples as well as milk, and to incorporate some diet information. And so this was really a place where I was able to start to answer some of the questions that I, as a mother, was really interested in, right? So, and of course, in great, anxious mom fashion, my thought was, how am I messing my kid up by not giving her milk? It turns out, just punchline, you're not messing up your children if you can't give them milk. We can make formula better, but it does a pretty good job. But anyway, in the midst of all of this, I had my second daughter, Eliza. And again, only belly picture, and it's a terrible belly picture. But that's the only one, because again, I'm not a big belly person. But this is her right after she was born. And then this is Nellie and her new baby sister. And so at this point, I was again struggling with breastfeeding, and it became even, not urgent isn't the right word, but it became really important to me that we figure out, what is it about milk that is driving brain development and subsequent behavior, and how can we make alternatives better? Big question, lots of people working on it. But that wasn't something that I was going to be able to pursue at Minnesota. They weren't. There's another brilliant woman named Ellen Demarath who's working in milk there, but she was interested in different questions. And so I needed somehow to move and begin my own independent research. And so I was able to do that by moving here. And so I know sometimes, and it can seem like you're having to convince people that moving to Roanoke or Blacksburg is, it's a good idea because it's beautiful. I didn't need to be convinced. It felt like home, maybe a little bigger than home, right? Because Northwood, I think, has 4,400 people in it currently. But I lived in big cities. I'd moved from New Orleans to Atlanta to Minneapolis, and Daniel and I were ready to go somewhere where there were mountains, but where we could do, where I could do where I could pursue the research that I wanted to do. And he, being the amazing partner that he is, opted to stay home with our kids. So he's a stay-at-home dad still, is currently surviving as far as I know. But my point is, it felt right. It was full circle. And what I've been able to do since moving here is to really explore this framework that I have. It's a very oversimplified framework, but this is how I think about things, right? So based on all of the past work that I've done, both in monkeys and in humans, we know that mom, beginning in pregnancy, and now there's actually evidence that even preconception characteristics can impact brain and behavior in kids. But mom is an entity. She's a person, right? She lives in a context. She has her own lived history. And I want to understand how she impacts her child through 3 parallel pathways. If you've heard me give a science talk, I typically start with this oversimplified framework. I'm sure someday I'll maybe make it a little more nuanced, but for right now, it helps me understand kind of, what we're trying to do. So anyway, so mom can influence her baby through how she cares for them. She can transfer microbiota, and she can support that microbiota through early nutrition, through milk or formula. And then there may be some direct impacts of early nutrition on brain. So I got here in August of 2019. We'd gotten everything geared up. I had hired the best team on the planet. We were ready to go. Our first infant scans were set for the week of March 23rd, and COVID hit. And so, it was hard, obviously. I mean, we all lived through it, or are living through it. But I think what I learned, and I attribute this completely to my upbringing and the example that my mother and my sister gave me, is, you take what you have and you not just make lemonade, you enjoy that lemonade because you made good lemonade. You make do with what you have. And so what my team did was we actually designed some remote data assessment protocols that have been published, and that we can use to get at some of the same kinds of behavioral questions that we want to get at, right? So it was an example again of how I think that my upbringing on a farm, and maybe not even a farm, but just by the women that raised me, you make do with what you have, and you are grateful for everything that you have, and that helps you get through unbelievably hard times like with COVID. And I think good things come out of it. What I'm also able to do here at FBRI is to, kind of try to disentangle other pieces of this, although complicated, still super oversimplified framework. And so one of those is looking at how microbiota impact brain development. And so we've done some basic work looking at the changes in gut, the bacterial community composition within the infant gut. We're trying to integrate this with some of the neural processes that are happening, doing a lot in doing some collaborative work, as well as trying to dig into some really big data sets. But really what the lab has been focused mostly on recently is this connection between milk and brain development. And sometimes I kind of think that I'm some sort of masochist, because it really is the one thing that I regret. That's the R word for sure, right? Regret is a terrible thing. And I do regret that I wasn't able to provide milk to my children the way that I had wanted to. But again, that drives me to really understand what it is about milk or feeding, or any of the complexities that occur during that interaction that's supporting brain development. Because my children, although they were formula fed, they're fine, right? I mean, there are millions of children that are formula fed and they're fine, but why? And why, let's understand that risk a little more. So my group is trying to dig in and look at extra nutritive components of breast milk. So this is one example of a growth factor, erythropoietin, that we've looked at in milk, and it does seem to increase across lactation. We're not sure what this lady is, what context she's living in. We want to understand what is it about mom and her diet, or whatever other characteristics are driving some of these things in milk. We're also looking at cytokines, and we're also looking at exosomal microRNA. But science apart, again, the point here is I want to understand what is it about milk that makes it special, and let's copy that. Let's make it available to everybody, because we know that duration of milk feeding does impact brain development. And so this is some work that was put together by one of my medical students, Sarah Yosef. And what we're showing, and this is with baby connectome data, is that there are differences in amygdala growth in babies that were exclusively milk fed through 1 year versus those who were not. And so this is more evidence that there's something in milk, and we have the erythropoietin data that I just showed you that's in the milk from these moms. And so what we're working on is how to integrate this really complicated, giant longitudinal data set. The other things that we're still working translationally. So, I was raised academically in animal labs, and I have a great deep appreciation for the kinds of questions that we can ask in animal models. And so this is our seal innovation project that was funded earlier this year. And we are, if successful, will be able to provide some of the first data about the cellular mechanisms of a very specific aspect of milk. So these are human milk exosomes, and we're specifically looking at microRNAs within these exosomes, how they're related to infant brain development, as shown here, as well as how they impact cultured oligodendrocyte precursor cells. So we will have some information at a cellular level and at a macro, kind of morphological level of what the specific aspect of milk that's not found in infant formula, how that's impacting brain development. So super, super exciting work. In the next year or so, we should have I will have some results to share with you all for that. But we're also trying to get more at what is it about mom, that in what contexts mom is found in, that impacts these pathways. And so here in Southwest Virginia, we've been really impacted by the opioid epidemic. So one of the things the lab really wants to do is support high-risk moms or vulnerable moms, and moms with opioid use disorder, or OUD, are certainly one of those groups. And so we're working on a project right now where we're trying to understand all of those pathways that I just showed you, but in the context of maternal or opioid use disorder. If I can provide those moms with tools to help them do what they want to do, which is raise, healthy kids, that I will die happy. And if we can do that through nutrition, or we can do that through therapy, or, this is kind of, Karen mentioned that my research program is very collaborative and very community-based, because I don't have all the answers, but I can talk a lot, as evidenced by this presentation. And I'm happy to ask around and to get that information, again, always with the goal of just supporting families to do what they want to do. And so I always like to, I'm not quite done, but I always like to end with this idea of what the goal of the lab is. This is why I get up every morning. Again, because I had the support of amazing women growing up and throughout my educational career. It's been great. So to actually wrap up, just some lessons that I've learned from my own journey. You really have to embrace all of the opportunities that you have, right? If I hadn't said, yes, I'd like to work with monkeys, who knows what would have happened? And not that it wouldn't have been great, but it wouldn't have been this path. And this has been an amazing trip. Inexperience can be a gift. And I mean that I didn't know that NIH was, that it was really prestigious. When I applied to graduate school, I applied to one grad school, not because I was confident. It was because I didn't know any better, but that was actually really nice because I knew where I wanted to go. It was a gift. It also gives you lots of perspective in different perspective on questions. Don't ever forget what's really important to you. And so for me, that was a family. And it's funny because when I got pregnant in graduate school, some people almost looked, apologetic when I told them, like, oh, like it wasn't, like we didn't want a baby. but it was important to us to start a family. And, I wasn't going to, I couldn't compromise, right? Biology is biology, and I didn't want to wait too long. So anyway, don't let things that are important to you go along the wayside. And then the last bullet point here is really embrace the research is me search thing, because that's what's going to keep you excited. And that's what's going to help you do the best work that you can, and to share that work and to help others do the best work that they can do. And then finally, I have to end with listen to your mothers. And I have an S there because, moms, I think, come in lots of different shapes and forms. I mean, maybe, you spend most of your time with your granddad or, whoever is that mom to you. Please listen to them and love them, because you have no idea, even if you have your own children. I don't know that I still understand how much my sister and my mother loved me and supported me throughout this whole crazy journey, which I don't know if anybody recognizes this picture. These are actually the headwaters of the Mississippi. And so it starts really, really humble, and then eventually goes down to the Gulf and is this massive powerhouse. But it's helped along the way by lots of natural, geological formations and things. And I feel like Journey's lived experiences is much like that. And we just need to recognize that. And for me, it was my mom's, right? My mother and my sister. So with that, I hope we have a few minutes left if people have questions or comments, and let's have a discussion.
Brittany, that was awesome. What a perfect example of how your lived experience and your science kind of intersected and grew together, and kind of overlaid on all of that was your resilience. And you just embody so many of the concepts of iTHRIV, with the community participatory research and translation and dissemination and impact and team science, all the things that we talk about. So really a wonderful example of all that. So I thought I saw a hand up. Mike, was that you? Did you want to ask a question? Or does anybody want to put a question in the chat?
I was just showing clapping hands, but since you asked, Karen, I did want to first of all say to Brittany, thanks, Brittany. That was really very insightful. I always enjoy hearing you talk. Great. I did want to, I'll go ahead and ask you. Your monkey work, you described to us the path and some of the serendipity involved in the human work. When you think about nowadays, for a lot of investigators, it's pretty darn hard to keep up a competitive research program in both the animal space and the human space. I mean, there are examples of people who do that, but I'm a firm believer, as I think you are, that they both inform each other, and it's important. So I'm just curious, going forward, how much of the more fundamental and the animal-based work do you see being able to incorporate and inform your human child work as well?
Oh, so that's a great question. I mean, the very simple question, at least, is how to address the difficulties in doing that is to form great, strong collaborations with people who know that work. I am very lucky that I had the hands-on experience. Like if I go to somebody and I can ask about doing monkey work, I know what that entails. So I'm not going to go and ask for, let's do 100 animals. I know that that's outrageous. But I still work with my PhD mentor. The work that we're doing here with pigs, that's through a collaboration with Paul Morton and VetMed. And we just came together with, a really strong shared interest. And, that collaboration grew very organically. So I envision not necessarily, having our own animal colony, right? I don't envision having our own mini pigs. But what I really hope happens is I can continue to work really closely as we are developing, different studies and asking questions, to think smartly about, well, what is it that we're finding out that can inform, Paul's next grant? And what is Paul finding out that might inform our next grant? And when does it make sense to do something like we proposed for our SEAL project and do it concurrently? Because it doesn't always make sense, right? It might not always make sense. But as you said, I think it is really important to recognize and always, as best you can, keep up with both, because, they are, things move really, really quickly. But short answer is I rely on good people, and fortunately I'm surrounded by good people. So that's not that hard to do.
Okay, thanks.
Great. We have a question in the chat for you, Brittany, about how you take the lessons that you shared with us and how do you incorporate those into your mentoring approach? Do you want to speak to how you now lead others in some of these same areas that you spoke so much about, how many people impacted you?
Sure. So I think the first thing I have to say is I don't know that I do many things strategically, at least with mentorship, and maybe that sounds bad, but I only know how to mentor in one way, and that's to be very honest with my mentees and to ask them lots of questions so that I can get a handle on what is important to you, where do you want to go, and if you don't know that, okay, well, that's important to know, so let's figure that out together. But for me, that was always something that my mentors did, was they didn't tell me what I wanted to do. And I mean that. They weren't like, you want to study this. No. It was, what are you interested in? And fortunately, I was able to find people who had funding to look at the questions that I found interesting, or were able to kind of, carve off a little piece. But I think what's really come through to me is again, that support for me as a person. So here's a perfect example. When I found out I was pregnant with my first daughter as a graduate student, we were doing a project where we were administering oxytocin to monkeys intranasally. So as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I had to tell EHS because they use oxytocin. So Pitocin is synthetic oxytocin to induce labor, and so I wasn't allowed to go anywhere near it as soon as I found out. And so I had to tell Mar when I was only like 8 weeks. It was real early, because I had wanted to wait until I was a little farther along. But anyway, so I told her, and she looked at me, and she had kind of a blank look on her face, and she said, "You're going to have a baby?" And I said, "Well, I hope so." That was kind of what I hoped would happen at the end of the pregnancy. And then she started to cry, and she came around and gave me a hug, because she had shared with me her own struggles with fertility, and I knew that she would understand. But it was that sharing and that recognition that I was more than just labor in her lab. I was a person, and she was willing to listen, and as much as she could incorporate that into our relationship. And sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes you can't relate to people, but you can always listen. And so I think for my mentoring, I do try to do equal parts listening and talking. But if anybody knows me well, I tend to talk a lot. But that it's putting weight on mentees as people as well as mentees, I think has been the most successful for me. And then of course, making sure you're doing science that you love and you're doing it well. But that's kind of the baseline.
Outstanding. So thank you again, Dr. Howell, for a great talk and a great example of how your lived experience feeds your science and your science feeds your lived experience. Again, a final housekeeping note. Thank you all for joining us. You will get a survey offered to you to share your feedback on our series, and please continue to send us your feedback and share with us additional topics or speakers that you think may be great speakers for this series. So we thank you very much, and we will see you again, I think, in September for our next talk. Thank you, everyone, for joining.